And so for giving an overview of the curriculum, I was actually just going to jump over into the curriculum document and just show you a couple things in there. This is the invasive species curriculum PDF document. It has a table of contents, just like any other document if you want to jump to a part you're interested in. To start, I was going to go to the background page because this actually gives a really good overview of what the curriculum is in general. So the main topics and questions it centers around. So what are invasive species? How do they impact students' lives? How do they spread? Are they present on the school campus or local areas? And thinking bigger, what can be done to manage invasive species and what can be done to prevent invasive species from coming in the first place. And the curriculum is broken up into 10 separate days. So each day is generally a 40-minute lesson. But I should mention right from the get-go that it's very flexible, very customizable. So maybe you don't have room for 10 40-minute lessons. That's totally fine. You can definitely look through and pick and choose the pieces that are most relevant or most useful to your classroom. Some days could be turned into a homework assignment. One example would be day 10 is an optional community service day where students would go out into the field and help manage invasive species or pull invasive species out of the ground or survey for invasive species. And that's obviously something that would take planning on the teacher's part and would take permissions. So that's definitely not required. I wouldn't expect everyone using the curriculum to actually do every single one of these lessons, but they are all there for you to choose from. So you could make your unit on invasive species as short or as long as you want it to be. Just depends how it all fits into your school year. And this page also shows you the overall objectives and aims of the invasive species curriculum. So students will be able to create a group research poster summarizing their invasive species study. They will analyze their field data to be used in their invasive species study, and they will summarize what invasive species are and how they impact humans. So that gives you an overview, and some of you may be interested in the next page, which are the standards. So if you look through these, middle school on the left, high school on the right, to see what standards this curriculum fits into. I won't go through them now, but I encourage you to take a look at that. And then the main part of this curriculum document is there's a page for each day. And so each page goes through the lesson for that day. And I'm not going to go through all 10. I'm going to show you what is included for each day. And then I'll go through, I think, 4, 5, 6, just to give you an idea of what some of the days look like. So each day's page has a summary, so how long it takes, what are the driving questions and objectives, what are the materials. Then it goes through what the activity actually is. And then a brief summary. And one thing I wanted to point out were these teacher tips at the end. So these are very useful tips that will really help you. So things that people who have implemented the curriculum have run into and have found helpful. So I encourage you to always keep an eye out for these teacher tips. For instance, this one links that TED Talk video that I showed earlier. And it also links to this PowerPoint. So I'll show you the PowerPoint real quick. So there is a PowerPoint that we have made available that kind of goes through the whole thing. So if you needed some slides to show for any particular lesson, there are some that are already put together and ready to go in this PowerPoint that you could use. All right, and so that's what you can expect for each of these sections, each of these days. So just to give you a taste of what some of them look like, I'm going to go to day 4. I'll do 4, 5, and 6. Um, and these are sort of the IMAP heavy days, which is why I'm choosing to highlight those ones in particular. So day 4 is iMapInvasives introduction. So which species are an issue on a local scale is one of the things that students will be exploring. And students will be able to plan a procedure for going out in the field and surveying for invasive species, and they'll learn how to use iMapInvasives online. So that one thing of prepping for the field, writing methods, that's something that will be very useful for students to learn. And this is also somewhere where, this lesson in particular is somewhere where we can help. So if you need any guidance or advice, we at the IMAP team could always help you out there. So things like you'll want to figure out, are students going to use their own smartphones to use the app? Or maybe do you have access to some tablets that groups could share and report records? We do also have a field form, so so it's also an option to input data online afterwards. But of course, the easiest way is probably if students could use tablets and report invasive species records that way. So that prep work is really important to make the next day, which is the field day, go smoothly. Another important part of this day's lesson is logging into the online interface and exploring records in the local area. So like you saw in the brief video I showed of using IMAP, you can zoom into your area and students can look around the database, see if invasive species are kind of found in clusters in certain regions, or maybe they are just all throughout your region. Maybe there are areas where invasive species are not reported. So students can explore the database that way. And of course, like any lesson, you could always assign pieces of this lesson as homework if you want to save more time in class. And then day 5, so this is the campus fieldwork day. So this is the day where students would be going out into the field, usually in groups. And again, this is somewhere where we can help give you advice if you read through the page and you still feel like you're not sure how exactly to implement this. For example, in some classes, the teacher has made a classroom iMapInvasives account that all the students share. In other cases, maybe individual students would want to create an IMAP account. So that's something we can help you through the pros and cons there. One tip I would offer on the field work day is to try to keep it simple and manageable. So it might seem like you would want each student to report 10 records or something, but that's actually a lot more work than it sounds, and you'll end up with, depending on how big your class is, you could have hundreds of records at the end of it, and that can be more time consuming than you would expect to look through that data and make sure the data is being reported properly, and have the students analyze that data. So we generalize recommend something a little bit simpler, like you could have, instead of each student reporting a certain number, you could have groups of students. For instance, you could have your class divided into 10 groups, and each group inputs one data point. And then you have a very manageable data set to look at the end. And one thing mentioned here that I will show later is that in the additional materials section of this document, there's a identification guide for 10 common invasive species. So that's very useful on this day, and I will show you what that looks like in a bit. And then so day 4 was preparing for the field, writing out a procedure. Day 5 was actually going into the field and doing that data collection. And then day 6 is where you actually look at that data. So students will have experienced going on into the online database, looking at data that was already there. And then on day 6, they can now go back onto the online database and they'll actually see the data that was there before, but also the data that they have collected. They will see that the data has actually been integrated into the real database. The activity is outlined here, and so students can look at the data that they've recorded and see any patterns, assess their research methods, and modify for any changes that have occurred in the field. And yeah, they can just look through the data that they have collected. One thing that I forgot to mention in the day 1 lesson, sorry, I'll click so that I don't scroll too fast through things, is that on day 1, I didn't go through it since it's mostly just like intro stuff, getting people in the invasive species mindset, making sure people understand what invasive species are as you get started. But one very important thing that is introduced in day 1 is the invasive species research poster. So basically a poster similar to a typical academic poster or a science fair poster, where there's an introduction with background information, methods that the students write on the field project, so the field data collection project, the results they collect, and then the conclusions. And so this poster idea is mentioned throughout the curriculum. A lot of the different lessons link back to it. So that can be very rewarding for students to have this research poster that they're building throughout the different days of the invasive species unit. And so hopefully that gives you an idea of what is in the curriculum. So the 10 days, and in each day there's a summary of what that day entails. And then after that, in the document, there are the supplemental materials. So these include, there's a lot of like worksheets and stuff that students can fill out. One thing that I wanted to point out was the field research form. So this form is what students can take out into the field and they can make their scientific observations with. For instance, when they observe a species, they would write down the name. They would make a sketch of some of the identifying parts that they learned about. So whether the leaf has alternate or opposite leaves, for example. Enter some data about the species, indicate where it is, and that sort of thing. So I was talking with one person who has implemented the curriculum, and they were saying how it was very useful. Students found it very interesting to do the 2 different types of data entry. So the using a paper form and drawing the invasive species and recording the observation that way, as well as using the mobile tool and uploading a record into the database that way. So that's the supplemental materials. And then next are the additional resources. And so this includes this handout that I was talking about earlier. So 10 common invasive species in New York, stuff like Multiflora rose, common reed, or Phragmites, which you'll probably recognize from the sides of highways, bittersweet, and several others. And so this is really useful because if you are equipped with identification information for these 10 species, you are pretty much guaranteed to find at least one of them wherever you look. The simplest way would just be to go out onto your schoolyard. If you have the interest and capacity to do a field trip to a local park or something, that's an option too. But either way, you are very likely to find one of these species, which I guess it's good because you want your students to be able to make those observations. And then the other thing in the additional resources is more information on some of the terms used in the document. So these botanical terms, as well as the partnerships for regional invasive species management that I mentioned earlier. So that was the overview. And I did want to make a note about the curriculum as a whole. So of course it was created with the intention of being an in-person unit. But of course, in the past 2 years, remote learning has been an important thing to consider. So while it is intended for in-person, it can be adapted for remote learning if that is of interest or needed by anyone who is on the webinar today. So some examples of what lends this course, the aspects of this curriculum that lend it very nicely to remote learning. So there are self-guided learning tutorials on our YouTube channel and at nyiMapInvasives.org/training. So those are great ways for people to, so you could get trained up on iMap that way. You could send links to your students so they could get trained up on iMap that way. Another key aspect is that it's an online database that you can access anywhere. So students could access the online database from home if they have internet connection. So they could explore the database themselves individually. But if you wanted to look at stuff together, you can also do that. So screen sharing is very useful for implementing instruction about invasive species or using the database remotely. So you can just share your screen and your whole class will be looking at the same map as you, and you can explore it that way. And then finally, so ideally, a field day could be done by people in the classroom going out together and looking for invasive species in the field. If that's not possible for certain schools or at certain times of the year, this field day could be done individually. So instead of going out together, students could go out in their own backyard or a local park if they have a parent who can bring them and look for invasive species that way. And so that was the general overview of the curriculum. So the next thing I wanted to discuss was what resources are available to you in any effort to implement this curriculum. So I'll show you where you can find everything.